Today, guys, we're going to follow up on our causes of the Boston Tea Party lecture from 2 lectures ago. I'm going to look at part 2, the new acts of organized resistance. This is lecture 14 in the Causes of the American Revolution series. Last time we looked at the tea tax of 1772 and the burning of the Gaspé. Just to remind us, the tea tax was caused by British Parliament seeking to maintain power over the colonies. And it was this weird anomaly in the American Revolution narrative where, for the most part, Americans and British saw eye to eye. The Americans no longer had to pay the townshend duties, so they were very happy. And the British also got to exercise their own power over the Americans, so they were happy too. We also learnt about the burning of the Gaspé in 1772. And unfortunately, whilst we see many happy Americans, the Rhode Islanders have to go and burn down a product or a ship of King George called the HMS Gaspé, a British ship that was used to stop the Americans from smuggling British goods into America. And so whilst we see a lot of agreement between the Americans and the British in the tea tax, we see rebellion from the Rhode Islanders specifically in the burning of the Gaspé. And this is all going to lead into the Boston Tea Party. Our learning intention today is to be able to explain the causes of the Boston Tea Party and analyse how organised resistance to the Crown was introduced within America. And the Boston Tea Party is going to be a significant event for us because it is going to embody the idea of organised resistance. And that organised resistance is what ultimately is going to be seen in the actual American Revolution War. Our suggested reading is in the textbook, page 106 to 109 for this lecture. Now, in 1772, there were 2 significant events and 1 significant response that we need to be aware of. The first significant event is the introduction of the tea tax, taxing American colonists who were importing tea. This affects approximately 99% of the colonists. The burning of the Gaspé is the other significant event, where smugglers and merchants such as the Sons of Liberty respond to ongoing taxation and duties, such as the tea tax. This is specific to Rhode Island, and Britain questions whether this is an act of treason. There is 1 significant response to this, and that response, it takes the shape of the Committees of Correspondence. This is a key knowledge area that you need to know about, the Committees of Correspondence. Sam Adams creates what's called a shadow government, so not an actual government, an offshoot of a government, a group that represents a government but isn't necessarily making any laws. He creates this shadow government within Massachusetts that asserts the natural rights of the Boston people in response to the claim of treason. So back, we've got significant event 1, the introduction of the tea tax, affects 99% of the colonists, and for the most part, they're okay with this. Then we've got the burning of the Gaspé, which is an unfortunate event caused by the Sons of Liberty movement, specifically in Rhode Island. And Britain responds to this by claiming that there is an act of treason. And Sam Adams hears about this and says the colonists in Rhode Island are pretty much just asserting their own natural rights. The colonists, he says, have been branded with the odious names of traitors and rebels only for complaining of their grievances. Adams is very clear in the fact that just because the Americans stand up and discuss and make known their grievances with Britain, they are now somehow acting in treason, and they are traitors and rebels for this. It just doesn't make any sense to Adams. And always remember the fact that Sam Adams, he is a propagandist, he's a highly influential radical, and patriot of the Americans. And so, he'll take any small thing, such as the reaction of the British to the burning of the gas bay. He'll take this and inflame it and make it a much bigger issue than what it was. And look, this is an issue, calling the Americans traitors. However, the British had some, justification for this, and Adams is taking this and saying, well, all the Sons of Liberty were doing was asserting their natural rights, and us people in Massachusetts during the Boston Massacre, we were asserting our natural rights, and despite all this, we are still being taxed in tea. So what Adams does is introduce this group called the Committees of Correspondence. And the committee's aim is to pretty much just make official a long-time correspondence between the colonies. For some time, we know, as we've seen in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Stamp Act Congress, for example, there are two examples, there has been correspondence between the colonies in a way to temporarily unite them against the British. Sam Adams, though, his motivation here is not for temporary unification, it's for organized and long-term cooperation and unification amongst the colonies. And the way that he thinks that is going to take place is through the idea of forever having correspondence between the colonies for whenever the British act in any way, shape or form that is going to persecute natural rights for the Americans, they have to make it aware to the rest of the colony. And so the committees of correspondence, which end up popping up in pretty much every state, their job is to let all the other colonies know that when their natural rights are being victimized, when the natural rights of the colonies are being mistreated by the British, the committees of correspondence have to let the rest of the colonies know, and by doing so, they are uniting or bringing together all of the colonies. Okay, so this is the committees of correspondence movement. Now, in 1773, so 1 year later, there is one significant event and two significant responses. The significant event that takes place in 1773 is the East India Company slump. And what this is actually, aside from everything that's going on in the American Revolution, is actually a consequence of another part of the British Empire, where the East India Company, okay, a company owned by the British, is in an economic slump. There's a decline in global importation of Asian tea, and this threatens the survival of the East India Company. And so the British have to respond to this, and there are two significant responses, one response by the British and one response by the Americans. The response by the British to the East India Company slump is the introduction of the Tea Act by Lord North. He proposes that the Tea Act will reduce the cost of importing tea for Americans, so they are tempted to buy more tea, which makes sense. It's like the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act saw the reduction in importation of British molasses, and the whole idea was to try to tempt or get the Americans buying more British molasses instead of molasses coming from the French West Indies. Same principle applies here. Lord North thinks, if I reduce the tax on tea, then the Americans will buy more tea. And if they buy more tea, then it will probably resurrect the East India Company. Okay, a lot more funding will go into the company, and therefore it won't go under. The colonies, unfortunately, don't see the same narrative taking place in their minds. Sam Adams actually sees this as an act by Lord North. It's a conspiracy. He says Sam Adams, the Sons of Liberty, and other radicals through the Committees of Correspondence. Okay, so this is the first act of the Committees of Correspondence. They pretty much refuse to unload British tea because of the Tea Act and the tea tax. The Tea Act is depicted by these groups and these individuals as a conspiracy Lord North to force Americans to pay more money to the Crown by delivering more tea to America than usual. And so, whilst Lord North thinks that the Tea Act is ultimately good for the Americans, okay, he's reducing the amount of importation duty that the Americans have to pay on when they buy tea. The colonies think, no, no, no. All you're doing is you're trying to trick us into buying more tea because there's a tea tax. And despite the fact that you're reducing importation duties on tea, you're just trying to get us to buy more tea because of that lesser duty. And when we buy more tea, the tax on tea will actually justify or balance everything out for you guys, and you'll end up actually earning more money than what you were originally. And so Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence primarily are the ones who tell the rest of the colonies, do not unload British tea when it arrives in your harbours. It's Lord North's way of trying to tax us even more than what he was originally. Okay, so it's this weird, convoluted understanding of what the Tea Tax and the Tea Act are trying to do. It's very clear what Lord North is trying to do, but Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, through the means of the committees of correspondence, so through these committees who make it known, like the same message get across to all the colonies, through this committee, they make it known that no, Lord North is actually, he's conspiring to make us pay more money in the long term, okay? So this is the first real act of the committees of correspondence, unifying the whole colony of America to not unload British tea. And this ultimately results in what's called the Boston Tea Party in 1774, specifically in, obviously, the area of Boston. Okay, this is a quote by an onlooker, George Hughes, of what the Boston Tea Party was. He says, "The tea destroyed was contained in 3 ships, lying near each other at what was called, at that time, Griffin's Wharf. On the day before the 17th, there was a meeting of the citizens of the country of Suffolk, convened at one of the churches in Boston, for the purpose of consulting on measures to prevent the landing of the tea, or secure the people from the collection of the duty. It was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet. After having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street after being thus disguised, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to the place of our destination. When we arrived at the wharf, there were 3 of our number who assumed an authority to direct our operations, to which we readily submitted. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain, and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and the dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks, so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of the water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempts was made to resist us." So whilst this observation by George Hughes gives us an insight into what happened during the Boston Tea Party, obviously, in short, these Boston radicals jumped aboard a British ship and threw British tea into Boston Harbour as an act of rebellion against the Tea Tax and the Tea Act. More importantly is Hughes's way of communicating that the actions of these radicals were very organised, and it's a reflection of what the committees of correspondence were doing. And we see this simultaneous organisation of the colonies against in rebellion against the British. Just to rehash, the communities of correspondence were an organized way for the colonies to communicate when tyranny by the British was being seen in the colonies. Okay, and through correspondence, they were able to stay on the same page. Every time one colony was subjected to tyranny, all the colonies knew about it and could act in resistance. The Boston Tea Party is another instance of organized resistance or rebellion. Okay, in bold you can see the phrases or words that are of significance here. I fell in with many who were dressed. We readily submitted. We had commanders. We immediately proceeded to execute his orders. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. So it's very clear in this passage by George Hughes that the Bostonians that were actually facilitating the Tea Party, they were acting in unison and as one against the British. And the British looked on in probably shock, but in this case, they looked on and just let the Bostonians do what they were going to do. They didn't interfere with this. Importantly is the idea that the Bostonians were dressed as Indians. And this is important for a few reasons, but I'm going to show you this image. Okay, this is an image by Nathaniel Currier in 1846 called The Destruction of the Tea at Boston Harbor. And when we look at images, we have to literally analyze them and then symbolically analyze them. And to literally analyze them, we ask, what do we see in this image? And I've pointed out 5 things that are evident in this image, okay, of the Boston Tea Party. First of all, number 1, men are dressed as Native Indians or Native Americans, okay, very clearly seen up here. Then we see raising of caps, okay, by the crowd. We see the colors of blue and green. We see dumping of the tea. And we see the waving off of a British ship. So we see in the background a British ship. Okay, it's very clear with the British flag here. And this crowd waving them off. Now, whilst we see these very literal observations, we then have to take these observations and interpret them symbolically, or try to make sense of what we see, what we observe, and we have to make sense of it and actually extract meaning from it. And so you can see here, I asked the question, what do these things represent? What's the symbolism here? Well, the symbolism is this. The men dress up as Indians, and a way of understanding this is that the Bostonians are a powerful resistance. Remember that the British are relatively fearful of the Native Americans or the Native Indians. They've experienced the powerful resistance of the Indians in the French and Indian War, and they have been very instrumental in drawing a line called the Proclamation Line through America to make sure that the Americans and the Native Indians aren't going to attack one another. What we can take away from this image is the fact that the Bostonians dressing up as Native Indians can represent that they are embodying the same power and the same resistance and actually striking the same fear into the British heart as the actual Native Indians would and have done during the French and Indian War. And so, it's not just sheer coincidence or just circumstance that the Bostonians decide to dress up as the Native Indians. I believe that it's actually a decision to reenact or embody what the Native Americans stand for. They stand for power. They stand for resistance. They stand for independence. And that is what's taking place here in the Boston Tea Party. The Bostonians are standing for independence. They're trying to exercise their power. They're acting out of rebellion and resistance from the British. Number 2, the raising of the caps, is just symbolic of the people that are standing in Boston Harbor agreeing or saluting what the Native Americans are doing, or what the Bostonians dressed as the Native Americans are doing. The colors of blue and green are interesting. Traditionally, the colors of blue and green have been colors of loyalty. And so this could ask the question, well, are the Americans being loyal to the British, or are they being loyal to the Native Americans? Well, in this case, they're saluting the Native Americans, or the Bostonians who are dressed as the Native Americans, and so they're being loyal to the actual resistance. They're not being loyal to the British. They're being loyal to one another. And so we can probably, or I would argue, we can extract from this a symbolism of blue and green representing loyalty, and loyalty actually being expressed through the raising of caps, saluting and agreeing the throwing or the dumping of tea. And by the way, that is our demonstration of rebellion. So what we see really down the bottom here is this scene of Bostonians saluting and agreeing the power, the resistance, and the rebellion of the Bostonians who are dressed as Native Americans. And they're being loyal to these Native Americans on the ship. And finally, we see in number 5, our 5th observation, waving off British naval ships, a victory over the British. So again, we see colors of green and blue, but it's a very distinct, community here, or distinct group. We see one group being directly in response to the Native Americans, and then we see another group in the background of this image, actually waving off or saluting the British ship in the background here. So overall, we can take many things from this, but I wanted to just deconstruct this image for us because it's another way for us to get evidence of what's actually taking place at Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party. We can read the actual narrative, and it's very clear what the Boston Tea Party is. It's taking tea and throwing it into Boston Harbor. But actually extracting more meaning from this are all these other things, all this other symbolism that's going on in images. And so we have to be aware of the literal understanding, what do we observe? What do we see in the image? And taking what we see and actually interpreting what each of those things actually mean. What's symbolic about this? Because everything in the image is positioned and placed in the image for a specific reason. Okay, that's what propaganda is. It's very direct and specific and politically structured and contextualized imagery. Okay, so when you encounter an image, always think about it literally, and then also think about it. Okay, what's the symbolic meaning of these literal observations? So what's the Boston Tea Party? It was caused by the Tea Act of 1773. It was triggered by Lord North's tea tax, Sam Adams's Committees of Correspondence, and the East India Company's economic slump. The consequences of this are significant. There is a new widespread organised resistance by the colonists. It's its first act against the British, and it's very direct. It's got a mission, it's got a goal, and it's very organised in both communication throughout the colonies and also in the actual action as seen in the Boston Tea Party. The colonists portray themselves as Indians, so they're portraying themselves as a powerful force, as a resistant force, as an independent force from the British. No longer are they depicting themselves as Britons, but as Indians. And by doing so, they are in some way, and this is stretching it, but I'm going to actually try to make the connection here. I reckon the actual imagery of dressing up as the Indian is the Americans' way of saying we are independent. Indian independent. Okay, so I think that's a very significant consequence of the Boston Tea Party, is the fact that the colonists are portraying themselves as Indians. There's the destruction of British tea, which costs incredible amounts of money to the British, and also challenges the East India Company once again. Okay, it doesn't help them. And Boston ultimately becomes the radical colony in all the colonies. And it gives reason for parliamentary sanctions on Bostonians through what's going to be called the Coercive Acts, which come up in future lectures. But we'll see quite clearly, first of all, we've had the Boston Massacre, and now we've seen the Boston Tea Party. And so Boston becomes the symbol of American radicalism, American republicanism, American patriotism, natural rights, all these things that have really spurred on and instilled a sense of rebellion by the Americans. Next time we're going to look at North's or Lord North's response to the Boston Tea Party in the Coercive Acts. If you've got any questions, please post them in the Google Classroom or see me in person and we can discuss this further.